So welcome everybody. We're sort of starting slowly because, as you know, we often take a while to get into Zoom. So apologies for not starting immediately. So my name is Tim Crabtree, and I'm chair of Dorset Community Energy, and I'm also a director of Wessex Community Assets. And I'll sort of explain a little bit about those two organisations and just introduce the seminar. Before I do that, we've been working closely with Laura from This Living Place, and I just wanted Laura to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I will be behind the scenes, letting people in the waiting room, people in from the waiting room. We've just had another one join, and also putting links in the chat and managing questions. So please use the chat if you've got any questions, and we'll filter them to the speakers at the end.
That's great. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so just a very quick bit of background to this evening's webinar. So Dorset Community Energy, we're a community benefit society. We have about 200 members. We've raised about 1.5 million to put PV onto schools, hospitals, and community buildings. And we do that through these share offers, and hopefully there'll be another share offer next year for other members to join. And Wessex Community Assets, we've been going for about 20 years, and we mainly have supported community land trust housing, but we've got interested in recent times about retrofit along with Dorset Community Energy. And we put in an application to the Southwest Net Zero Hub, and they have a community energy fund. So we were very fortunate to get a grant from the Southwest Net Zero Hub to look at the feasibility of setting up a community-led retrofit service for Dorset. We're working with a whole lot of partners on this project. You can see the list there. And most of those are in Dorset, but we also are working with a really interesting organisation, another community benefit society called People Powered Retrofit, which is an organisation that came out of a thing called Carbon Co-op in Manchester. And so the last thing I'll say before I introduce our speakers is that retrofit is very complicated. We have been looking at whether it's possible to provide a service in particular to homeowners or to people, landlords who provide private rental accommodation. But already there is lots of activity in this space. And so part of what we're exploring is where are the gaps and how can we best contribute into this space. But I'm sure that Peter in particular will be able to say a bit more about this landscape of support for retrofit. So I think that's all I want to do as a kind of introduction to this evening. At the end, I'll explain about the next 3 webinars that we will be running, and also the in-person event that we've organised for the 1st of March, which will be the morning of Saturday, 1st of March in the WI Hall in Bridport, if you're able to go. And Peter will be there to follow up with questions, and there'll be many other organisations represented. So I shall move on to introduce our 2 speakers. So I'll start with Jenny. So Jenny is, I think, chair of Sustainable Dorset. You'll have to nod or shake your head if I get it wrong, but I think you're chair of Sustainable Dorset. But Jenny, having bought a old old house, I suppose you can say. Jenny will explain more. Then went on a retrofit journey, and in that journey has both retrofitted her home, but also become a retrofit assessor or advisor for pre-1919 buildings. So obviously in Dorset, we have a lot of pre-1919 buildings. We also have a lot of post-1919 buildings, and I'll say a bit more about that towards the end, and Peter will as well. Yeah, so it's great to have Jenny. Jenny is going to start, and then we'll move on to Peter. So Peter is Managing Director of Ridgewater Energy and has worked in this sector for 28 years, I believe, starting with the Dorset Energy Advice Centre, which was the precursor to Ridgewater Energy. Ridgewater works very closely with Dorset Council, health authorities, Bournemouth and Poole and Christchurch Council, so has amazing expertise and experience in this sector. So we're very fortunate to have both Jenny and Peter with us. This initial webinar is very much introductory. We designed the 4 webinars to sort of start at an introductory level, and then the next webinar will be going into more detail about building physics, building fabric, and heat pumps in particular. Then we'll be looking at natural materials in some detail. And finally, we'll be looking at how we can work together, not just individually, but how can we work together in our communities to tackle retrofit problems. So that's the background to the webinar. And I'd like to pass over now to Jenny. So we raised a couple of questions for the speakers to answer to get us going. But as Laura said, if you have particular questions, put them in the chat, and then at the end we can address those questions. So the first question to Jenny is, what is retrofit and why is it important for homeowners and communities?
Well, first of all, good evening, everybody. It's great that there are so many people on the call. I also just wanted to say I'm not in my usual space, so if apologies for any unexpected noises and so on that might happen. I was going to ask, first of all, just by a raise of hands, how many people have already started their retrofit journey? I don't know whether you could indicate that. Anyone already made some progress towards retrofitting? I can't see any hands. Anyone? No? Oh, 1 or 2, yes. Okay, thanks for that. Just gives me an idea of what to expect, or what perhaps people know or don't know already. And as Tim mentioned, I specialise in pre-1919 buildings, and the significant date is that most properties then had a damp-proof course after that. So, starting to answer the question in what is retrofit, according to the dictionary, adding a component to something that did not have it when it was manufactured could be described as retrofitting. But how does that apply to buildings? So any improvement work carried out on an existing building to improve energy efficiency, make it easier to heat, able to retain heat for longer, and replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. It's what can be considered to be retrofit. Before a retrofit assessment is carried out, it's worth ensuring that the property is reaching its peak performance. So in the way that we have our cars serviced, do you do the same with your house? So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Laura. So do you check annually, or sometimes more often, everything around the outside of your property to make sure that there are no problems with it? So this could be, as a keen gardener, have you piled up lots of compost higher, so it's above the damp-proof course or where that would have been, and therefore causing damp to the bottom of the walls? are the air bricks still exposed, because they're required to obviously keep air flowing under the floorboards? Is the drainage sufficient? And particularly when now we have heavier rainfall, that's something that may need upgrading, because the size of gutters and downpipes is not perhaps able to cope with the amount of rain coming. What state is the mortar or render in, and what is it made of? So if it's not made of a lime base, then it won't be able to breathe properly, and there may be damp and mold problems internally. Are the downpipes and guttering in good condition and free from obstruction? I always have a quick check when it's pouring with rain to see if there are any places where the water is just pouring over the guttering, and therefore know that I've got to unblock things as soon as the rain stops. Are windows and doors, including the frames, in good order? Sometimes that can be a place where the wood has rotted underneath the paintwork and it's not as easily visible as you might expect. So close inspection of the frames is important. If your chimneys are still functioning, do they need, they obviously need annual cleaning. Make sure there's no birds nesting. And if you're not using them, then they can be temporarily blocked internally to keep drafts out. And then what type of roof have you got, and in what state is it? So if you've got any loose tiles, that can be a place where damp gets in. If there are cracked tiles, it's also another thing to consider. So if you could go on to the next one, please, Laura. And then take a good look around the inside, especially into rooms that you might not use as frequently. Check the heating, whether the radiators are working, and in rooms where you're using the room as much, turn the heating down, the thermostats and so on. And you might be asking yourself, what relevance is all this to retrofitting? But in order to retrofit, you want to make sure that everything is functioning as well as it can, so that the assessor, when they come round, can see how the property is working. So insulation is certainly a good starting point. In the loft, you could have sarking board that is fitted underneath the actual slate roof, and then as thick as possible natural fibre insulation in the floorboards or in the boarding between the loft. Sorry, let's just lose my voice here. And what sort of lighting have you got? Have you upgraded all your light bulbs to energy efficient ones? And here are some of the methods of upgrading the heating system. So you can see that the oil tank hasn't been removed yet on the left-hand side. And then the heat pumps have been fitted into what looks like a woodshed. So when people say with a listed building, it's very difficult to upgrade it. Here it is with something that's looking less obtrusive than the original oil tank. Thank you, Laura. Can I go on to the next slide, please? So this was the condition of the property when we first bought it. And as you can see, even just starting with basic maintenance, if the gutters had been kept in place, then a lot of the destruction to the windows and so on wouldn't have happened. And the roof, I'm not sure whether you can quite see the detail there, but instead of the slates being overlapped the usual amount, they were skimped. And so a lot of the beams in the roof had rotted away. So hopefully your properties don't look in that state. Next slide, please. So this is the underfloor heating going in with limecrete on top of it. Again, another way that a listed building will still be able to breathe, because you've got a breathable floor there. And underneath there's insulation with crushed glass. So next slide, please. If there aren't any more. So here we have I'm just slightly going on now to the next question, why it's important for homeowners to retrofit their properties. And this shows you instantly why it is important, because you lose so much heat through the various aspects as shown here. So 35% through uninsulated walls, 25% through the roof. But if you fit as much insulation as you can, and extra layers of sarking board and so on, you'll lose very little heat. Then the windows themselves, if you can't have double glazing, you can fit secondary glazing, and also have thick insulated curtains and sometimes shutters, which all help to halt the heat loss. And through doors, make sure that there aren't any cracks around the doors. And also sometimes you've got an old door that can be changed and it's very thin and losing a lot of heat just through the actual fabric of the door. So that's why I would say that's why it's important to an individual to cut their carbon emissions, to make the house easier to sell in the future, and also to rent, because in order to rent a property, it has to have a certain, I think it's a C now, on its EPC assessment. And also the house will be healthier. So if you're in an older property, it's more likely to be damp, have condensation and so on. Whereas if it's been retrofitted, then that will be, it'll be much more comfortable to live in. Why it's of importance to the community is that the neighbours can learn from each other. They can possibly have joint purchases of PV panels to reduce costs. There's less pollution from oil tankers visiting the village to fill up the oil tanks, and that's obviously in rural areas. Thinking in flats, there could be community heating systems like the shoebox system that Kenza heat pumps have come up with. And then also there are some community linked in heating systems that are starting to be installed in small villages as well as in larger communities. So that would be my reasons to suggest that it's important.
That's great. Many thanks, Jenny. So now moving on to Peter. What would be your take on that initial question of what's retrofit and why is it important?
Well, in terms of my journey through this industry, it kind of predates the use of the word retrofit. It's more of a buzzword that's come around in the last 4 or 5 years for us in the industry, more off the back of work by people like Dr. Peter Rickaby on the PAS 2030, 2019 standards, which have then since moved on to other versions, in which they've been seeking to improve the energy efficiency sector and the standards of the work that's being carried out and the way in which it's carried out, and the fact that ventilation is then a very important part of retrofit as well, when you're insulating buildings and doing fabric improvements in particular. So the word retrofit itself has really only been around for a short period of time in relation to this kind of work. One person said to me they thought it was great because it helps to simplify, because really what we're talking about, as Jenny said, was we're talking about improved heating or going to low carbon heat. We're talking about ventilation, insulation, renewable low carbon technologies, and it just simplifies that into one word that kind of covers all of that and encompasses all that sort of work. So when you're talking about it, it makes it easier from a communication point of view than going through all those different measures. Why is it important? Well, obviously there's many reasons why it's important. There's 2 things that are very top of my list, and that obviously is climate change mitigation, but it's also about people and keeping people warm and healthy in their own home so they can achieve affordable warmth. And there are a lot of benefits around, those sort of things. I mean, particularly in terms of healthcare, when you look at the amount of people that are living in cold, damp homes and what effect that can have on respiratory, cardiovascular, autoimmune conditions, what impact that has on mental health as well for people who are struggling with energy bills and such as well. And then, you know, in terms of the CO2 reduction side, you know, we've got this massive undertaking to get to net zero. It is an incredibly difficult challenge to meet, which, as we probably know at the moment, the government is not pushing hard enough on to actually meet. But you know, all the same, there are targets in place, and we're driving towards those for the right reasons. You know, it's about improving that indoor air quality, but also outdoor air quality in terms of the nitrous oxide and everything that's coming from fumes from cars, but also from home heating. So if there's more chimneys blowing out, you know, particulates and gas boilers kicking out the excess gas that's not burnt, etc., it's all adding to various types of pollution, which are affecting all kinds of things in nature, but also people's health. We've then got obviously the impact that it can have on moving to a more sustainable development model of growth within the economy. At the moment, we are seeing some awful backtracking by the corporates around some of the corporate sustainability goals and things they have on these boards, who are looking to now drive profit again ahead of looking after the planet. So you know, we've got to push against that as well. So that is hugely important that we keep an eye on that and try to keep the tide from turning. Obviously, we've got the lower energy bills, and that also has an impact economically in terms of money in the local economy that hopefully is spent, particularly with low-income households who are more likely to spend that money because they need to. So that has an economic impact that's very positive for the local community as well. Obviously helps again with the sort of work that a lot of the guys on this call are doing in terms of community cohesion, of coming together and communicating all these ideas and all these co-benefits of all this kind of work. There's a lot of positive momentum right now in particular, where we're all trying to work together for a common goal, and that's also a massive plus to this kind of work. Also, we're also talking about preserving buildings like Jenny has done, and when we retrofit them and we're considerate of their age and their features, it can be a barrier, obviously, which we'll move on to, but equally it's a good opportunity to improve the housing stock, because most of the housing stock we have now we will still have in 50 years or so. So this is why we focus on retrofit. And although, you know, it's very frustrating around new builds and the fact that standards still aren't high enough there, retrofitting existing buildings is still probably more important for us to have in our crosshairs to carry on doing as well. Also, driving that kind of retrofit can help take advantage of other things like time of use tariffs. So people have got that kind of infrastructure in the home where they're charging their car, they've got the heat pump, they've got the solar PV to help offset some of that cost. Then time of use tariffs just reduce costs further, because you can use your charging points and solar provision together to offset your costings as well. So there's also the benefit of that. It also helps reduce maintenance costs if you've repaired and made good a building and kept it well ventilated in terms of mold and damp damage and redecoration that might be required, rotting timbers and things that can come from wet rot and dry rot and all these kinds of property conditions. So it's also helpful in that respect as well. So that's a few of the kind of benefits and importance of retrofit. Hopefully that's given enough info.
That's great. Thank you very much. So then the second question we wanted to ask, and starting with Jenny again, is around the barriers. We know that there's something like 27 million houses that need to be retrofitted in this country, which is quite a challenge. But we also know that there's a lot of resistance to retrofit for lots of different reasons. And so we just wanted to touch on what are the barriers that people face in retrofitting, and perhaps how can we start to make the process easier. So Jenny, would you like to start with that one?
Yes, thank you. I think that's something that I come across the most, is the barriers and the reasons people put forward as to why they're not going to start retrofitting. Cost is obviously a huge consideration, but I'm going to leave that one, because I'm beginning to think that more of a problem is the sort of behavior change needed, the sort of psychological and emotional aspects. Also, people aren't sure where to start because, as Tim, you said at the beginning, it's a big challenge. But I found an Oxford study where they assessed some people that had gone through retrofit, and they came up with, I thought, some quite interesting discoveries. So the home is a place of great emotional significance. You know, we might have spent a lot of years saving up to buy it. We've done a lot of decorating and maintenance already. And positive retrofit experiences, they discovered, were identified into 5 different categories. So you had control over your own environment if you carried out the retrofit. The health, well-being and happiness in everyday life increased. Climate concerns and caring identity in a low-carbon home. So it's linked to an identity of with a broader social responsibility, so that the people who had retrofitted their home felt that they were contributing to more than just their own benefits in their own properties. Financial considerations and future resilience. So as the weather deteriorates, we face more challenges. The fact that your home is more able to cope with that sort of thing. And then finally, a full integration between an individual and their environment, so they're able to control the environment they live in. So with those different types of changes, or with those behavioural changes, there come many benefits. So I think if we can somehow add to our arguments rather than just say retrofitting your property is good for your house, it's good for you, but it will save you money. Those are certainly some aspects, but it's also, there are many other benefits to it, and perhaps we should put more emphasis on those. As to how to make it easier, I think that, well, again, funding, finance, perhaps a mentoring system, so that you find someone with a similar property, and a bit like Dorset Can's homes, people can visit the property and see what's been done, and then they're offering a service that if they need any advice, they can talk to the property owner. There's also the Happy Heat Pump podcast, where they've got certainly lots of advice on there. And then also identifying trigger points, because if you're aware that certain happenings in your life could be a trigger point to starting retrofit, I would suggest that that is something to think about. So that could be moving house. Just put a note in, you need an EPC rating of E or below in order to rent a property. So if you're moving house, that's a consideration. If you're planning an extension, that could be a time to look into other things that could be done at the same time. If a new baby is expected, you'd want to make the home as healthy as possible for a baby. If you're fitting a new bathroom or kitchen, again, that could be a chance because there's a lot of disruption generally. So it would make the work simplified. If you have grandparents moving in, another reason to make changes. And changing a boiler, because then if you've got an existing gas or oil boiler, at some stage they will need to be changing. And you need, having spoken to someone recently and they decided to put a new oil boiler in because it seemed more straightforward, then I think that's another time when people might need more advice to help them to perhaps make a different decision. And roof repairs, again, if you're taking slates or tiles off the roof, that's another chance to fit more insulation without too much cost. So those are my suggestions for what are some of the solutions to the barriers.
That's great. Many thanks, Jenny. Just to say, if people are looking at the chat, we're putting various resources into the chat, which you might want to download. For example, there's a number of really good guides that are being produced in different parts of the country at the moment. and yeah, so worth having a look at. Peter, would you like to address that same question?
Yes, thank you, Tim. So, yeah, I'll give you some of the barriers from, you know, our perspective, and when we're dealing with clients locally. As Jenny said, cost is often a barrier, albeit 99% of the stuff that we manage and do is free to the people who qualify for it. We find obviously access to grants is difficult because you've got a lot of different criteria for different schemes. There's a lot of eligibility, and people don't understand that it's not just the fact that they need to qualify, it's that often that the property needs to qualify as well, which can be quite frustrating. To give you an example, there is something called eco flexible eligibility under the Energy Company Obligation 4 scheme, which opens up additional eligibility, like health conditions, if you have them that are affected by a cold home. And people then think, well, I must be able to get what I want then, because, you know, I'm suffering with poor health. But their property still has to qualify. The EPC rating has to be right. It has to be a mixture of certain measures that can be funded. And even then, if their EPC it qualifies, but it's still a D, for example, then the funding is dependent on how low the EPC is. So the funding is low and will not cover the cost of the measures that are required. So the eligibility piece is a big barrier, and of course that's one reason we exist, is to try and demystify the eligibility, help people understand it, ask the right questions, and try and get them to a point where they know whether they qualify or not, and to get them on the journey to getting something done. But it certainly doesn't help us, and even we get confused sometimes and have to take a minute to look into it all and do a bit of desk-based research on everything before we call or email someone back with what we can actually help them with. Finance, access to finance, because there's a whole middle ground that, you know, that we've talked about as well recently. You know, that there's a lot of people who aren't in the upper echelon of income, haven't got a massive load of savings when they retire, for example, who can go ahead and do all these improvements. There's a whole middle ground of people that can't afford to pay out for that work, but actually they probably could add it to their mortgage and spread that cost over a longer period of time. They could potentially get a loan for 5 to 10 years to help introduce some of those measures, some of those trigger points that Jenny mentioned. So there are options, but again, there's a fear around lumbering themselves with more debt and what the cost of debt is, given we've been in a cost of living crisis, and everyone's been quite cautious that they're not going to fall into trouble by doing that as well. So there's definitely some work to be done there around lower interest rates on finance. You know, there's some good work going on by Lendology on the loan side, but really we could do with more offers coming into the marketplace at 0%, like Octopus are offering, and people like that. Not saying that Octopus do everything right, because they are a market disruptor and they don't always get it right, in my opinion. But they are doing some good stuff. There's also a massive trust issue with installers, and you know, we've had a recent, for those who know, there's been 39 installers recently suspended because of poor quality workmanship on internal and external wall insulation. Thankfully for us anyway, it's mainly in the Midlands and up north, where, you know, rows and rows of terraced houses have been getting this kind of work, and it's been done, you know, in a substandard fashion. And there's been a failure there for the regulators that's supposed to sit across these things to have any teeth to actually do anything and put some decent inspection regimes in place to prevent this kind of sharp practice and poor quality workmanship. So there's a big furore going on at the moment, and hopefully that there'll be some more improvements to everything going forward. But there's been, you know, trust issues with cavity wall insulation, because again, you've had installers who've not done that work correctly, and at the end of the day, you're only as good as the guys on the end of the tools on the day who are doing the work. So again, inspections and checks are key to giving consumer confidence around the fact that these things are being done properly. In fact, Tim and I visited a property not a couple of weeks ago and found that the cavity was supposed to be filled and it was practically empty. So we're still coming across these issues, sadly. Hopefully we're trying to address them locally at least. There's also a fear of sharp practice, so being overcharged, looking at someone's car in the drive and saying, oh, we'll put £2,000 on this job because obviously they've got money. That happens particularly with things like in the past with double glazing, more recently with spray foam, which I would say to everybody, please stay away from spray foam and do not go near it. Terrible product, not really of much use for anything apart from filling a hole around a pipe, and even then be careful. Just absolutely awful. And there's been companies that have created circular business models who will phone people 2 years later and say, I hear you've got spray foam. Would you like us to come out and remove it for you for £2,000? Great business model if you can get it. And sadly, we are plagued with lots of those companies in the Dorset area in particular. So it's that kind of trust stuff that is holding us back in terms of what can be achieved. There's then media mis and disinformation around things like heat pumps and their performance. All the reports and studies that have been done into heat pumps have found that they're working really well in old and new buildings alike. If they're properly specified and they're properly installed, and people get good advice and support on how to use them. Schemes that we run, we have to have very thorough surveys done. We have to follow the retrofit process, and the installers have to follow MCS procedures, and we have to ensure that we're going to leave someone with lower energy bills after that measure installed. So there has to be quite a good sort of percentage of sort of assurance in that they're not going to be paying more after it's been fitted. And we've just fitted about 70 heat pumps under the Home Upgrade Grant 2 in Dorset, and we've had no issues in terms of customer satisfaction with that work, because we're using good contractors who spend the time and install that properly and give good advice to back it up. So again, media misinformation is a massive barrier. Property condition, Jenny's already touched on that. So I would sort of single those out with some of our top barriers. How can we overcome it? By working together, by opening up grant eligibility and simplifying it over time. So dealing with the most vulnerable first, but most importantly, then opening it up as we go along to open up grants and funding to wider groups. We've done that traditionally under schemes in Dorset, where when the utilities were offering free installations for people over 70, with the council, we did it for over 60, then for over 50s, etc. We've always tried to go beyond what the national grants can do to do more locally, to extend out the criteria. So again, we can carry on doing that kind of thing. Obviously, by specifying suitable measures for the property. Again, as Jenny said, ideally we want natural, sustainable products. Unfortunately, our industry doesn't ordinarily support that because they're more expensive. So there's kind of a race to the bottom when it comes to utility targets and the products that they are allowed to use, and it costs a lot of money to get something accredited in the way it needs to be to enter the marketplace for funding eligibility. So some of those manufacturers, if they're not large manufacturers of natural products, they won't want to play in that arena because it becomes very expensive to join the club, if you like, which is wrong, and they should be supported to get involved. But that is another barrier. Way of helping is word of mouth. There's no better recommendation than a word of mouth from your friend, neighbor, or family member to say, I had this done, it was fantastic, that company were great, you should go ahead and get it done. That you can't get any better than that from our point of view. Case studies will help. Shouting about good practice, not just complaints. So often these review sites have got complaints and things on them, but people are very reluctant to be a case study, particularly in our arena, because they don't want people to know anyone benefits, or they're in ill health or on a low income. So that's always a challenge for that. And we always try and explain why we need the case study. And it's also communicating to your target audience. Don't come out with generic communications. If you're targeting private landlords, talk to private landlords. Talk to them about what you think is going to be their drivers to actually take action and do things. Whether that's regulation, whether that's lower maintenance, whether that's retention of tenancies, or not getting housing inspections, or whatever it is. Talk to that audience about what the benefits are, because they're not universal across all the tenures. We also then need more regulation. You need the carrot and the stick, really. Someone's already mentioned in the chat about, there's a consultation out again now on the minimum energy efficiency standards for private landlords. We hope that comes in. I'm speaking to 125 BCP landlords tomorrow. in Camford Road, about what's available, and I'm sure someone will be grilling me about that consultation and moaning at me that they're going to have to pay up to £15,000 out to make improvements. But we've had EPC since 2008, so you knew it was coming one day, and we tried to tell them. But it's time we improve the sector. What else is there? I'm rambling a bit now. The time to help someone get retrofit done is when they're ready to have it done. So we need consistency. We need a program that's there for 10 years, so that when someone moves house, or they have a child, or they do move their grandparents in, all those things that Jenny mentioned, that we can say, yes, we've got a grant for you, we've got some funding, and we've got some finance. We don't want to say is, oh, you missed out on that. That's finished. That's ended. Consistency is a massive removal of barriers as well. I'll leave it there because I've probably rambled on enough for the time being. Thank you.
No, that's really great, Peter. Thank you so much. So before I open it to some of the questions that we have in the chat, of which we've got many, and please, if you have more questions, just put them in the chat and then we can address them. But just to say that both Peter and Jenny are going to be at the open morning on the 1st of March in the WI Hall in Bridport, and are there able to answer questions that you've had. Yeah, Jenny obviously has a very broad range of knowledge, and particularly about listed buildings and older buildings, and Peter with his experience, including of grants that might be available as well. So please do come and join us and come and talk to Peter and Jenny and others at that event. So some questions. So maybe, Jenny, we'll start with you. There was a question about the challenges of listed buildings and thatched buildings, which presumably you've given quite a lot of thought to. Is there any, I don't know, what's the sort of first thing that you would start to think about if you are in a conservation area, in a listed building, or have something like a thatched cottage?
Yes, so if you're in a listed building, then obviously there's certain considerations, and you do need permission for some of the different changes and upgrades. But you wouldn't need anything to put in secondary glazing, for example, because that's easily removed. But if you were to replace the panes of glass that were already in the window, then that would be unlikely to be accepted, unless if it's a conservation area. In the rear windows, that probably would be okay. With things like that I showed the examples of, that was all in a listed building. So the limecrete floor with underfloor heating, the floor there had completely rotted away. So we were able to put in the limecrete floor. And the heat pump, you can fit a heat pump into a listed building. If it's an air source heat pump, you need planning permission for the exterior fitting of it. The thing is to get in touch with your conservation officer and see what they think. Also, Dorset Council, and you can find on their website, I don't know whether we've got that as a link, but they did produce a list of things that are allowed for listed buildings. Nothing that's really that helpful, actually, and not much of a change from what was previously allowed. But you can put PV panels in, for example, a rear garden, or if you've got a garage or a more modern extension of a listed building, that is now something that is looked favourably upon. With the thatched cottage, presumably it's the insulation in the roof because of the thatch. It gives it insulation anyway. So I'm not sure, unless we had a one-to-one, what specifically you were thinking of. So I'm not sure who asked that question. But it definitely, with listed buildings, it is more on a case-by-case basis, because it obviously depends on the construction of the property, what type of windows and so on.
The difficulty with the listed buildings, though, is you say you talk to the conservation officer. Well, straight away they won't talk to you unless you put in a pre-app.
Yes,
so then you've spent a load of money just speculatively in case you might have the possibility, and then a few months later you've finally got a decision which isn't binding. It's just an officer's opinion, and it depends on which planning officer or which conservation officer you get, because it's up to their own personal interpretation. And we've had it before where we've had approval to a scheme based on, it wasn't actually a historic building, this one, but we had a written pre-application document, and then we spent another probably £10,000 or so of fees developing that design. Got it right up to readiness for, well, beyond planning actually, and then new conservation officer comes into post and they said completely the opposite. So it's the unknown, I think, puts a lot of people off. The unknown. They've declared a climate emergency, and you say you can't have can't have double glazing on a listed building. Well, we've done that before with the Pilkington. It's like the slim light stuff, but with the little beads. But generally you can't. But it depends again on the individual situation. But do you want to pay £500 for a pre-application consultation for a £500 window? Not many people do.
No, it's. I mean, I didn't say it was easy at all, but I can completely.
I was just going to say that we've had a couple of inputs from Belinda Borden, who's a Dorset Council councillor, in the chat. Belinda, I don't know whether you are able to say anything about this, because clearly there is. Hopefully there are changes at a national level in relation to policy, making it easier for us to upgrade, retrofit listed buildings or work in conservation areas, but it is proving challenging at a local level. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts on how we can find ways to influence conservation officers, listed building officers at Dorset Council. I know it's hard, but maybe you could say something.
Don't know where to start, really. I know that the sustainability checklist and the listed buildings guidance, we were told at the time, went above and beyond the minimum government regulations. What I don't know, and haven't really got any direct evidence one way or the other, is whether that's actually been put into practice. Because anecdotally it doesn't always seem to be. I don't know, it's very difficult. Even within, I've just got a small patch of Lyme Regis and Charmouth, and even within my patch I have completely different experience in general with planning decisions between those two places. So yeah, I don't know. I am to be convinced that everybody in the planning department fully understands, the climate and sustainability agenda, but I can't put my fingers on anything specific.
What I would say is the sustainability checklist is helpful, but there's also a contradiction between well, not necessarily a contradiction, but there's a potential difficulty with you can get planning permission for one thing, and then building regulations, you find actually, no, you can't. So you end up having to do thermal calculations and everything before you put planning permission in. So again, huge amount of expense doing all those calculations and designing everything, only to find out, well, no, actually couldn't have a house there in the first place. It's very difficult to get. You could put in an application in principle, actually, you can do that sort of thing. But the sustainability checklist is helpful because it really focuses our clients' minds. We've had them before that have been insistent they want to keep their old oil-fired boiler because that's got at least 5 years in it. And I'm like, you're re-roofing, put some solar panels. We don't want solar panels. And when they get the checklist and realise actually it's going to be easier to get planning permission if they do the right thing, I think it helps.
Well, we've recently lost a conservation officer as well, so that's always a difficulty with local authorities, that it's very hard to get people to stay in, working for the council because they can go to the private sector.
So I have a meeting in a couple of weeks' time with one of the senior sustainability officers at the council, and I've been talking to them about Cornwall, for example, where they've got a housing decarbonisation task force and producing, sort of recommendations. And we've also been looking at the Architects Climate Action Network, which I put in the chat before, but they have a a conservation area toolkit where they've looked at best practice across London boroughs, sort of compiling that into one go, which you can then give to listed building officers and others. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to be showing.
Yeah.
There is flexibility in the system,
Yeah.
and there is good practice around, and we need to bring that together to say this is what we could be doing in Dorset.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to ask a question at the next full council along those lines. If we catch up afterwards, if there's anything I can do to push it, because definitely the sustainability team are very much, on board with everything. It's whether everybody else has had the opportunity to learn and understand why they need to do things in a particular way. Let's talk about it.
Okay. No. I mean, it's an issue that I've raised with Southwest Net Zero Hub, and said that this is a critical issue. So that's great. So to finish, two sort of other areas that have come up in the chat, and maybe I can ask Jenny and Peter to deal with them. So Peter, could you say something about this challenge of finding the right installers or the right builders to do the work? I know you mentioned sort of recommendations, but in your experience, how can householders sort of navigate this sort of quite difficult path of finding the right people to do the work?
Yeah, it's not easy, and of course I have to say, we've got a fair idea. We've got our own supply chain that we deliver projects under, but there's a lot of other really good companies out there clearly that are delivering on these agendas as well. I mean, in an ideal world, all these installers, apart from the accreditations that they have to hold, would be registered with things like Bywater Confidence, which is Trade-in Standards own trusted trader platform. But many aren't on there, and it's sometimes hard to find tradesmen beyond your plumbers and electricians on that type of platform. Anybody that's fitting things like solar panels is going to be on MCS. So I mean, they are just changing some of the MCS installer criteria and kind of practices at the moment. So they're going to strengthen some of those up. Clearly, because of what I mentioned earlier around this external internal wall insulation, they'll also be firming up processes around those very risky measures. But again, I'd say local is better. From what Daniel was just talking about, if you understand your local planning department, you understand the buildings that are in your area, you understand where the subsidence is likely to be, where the flooded, where the ex-marshland was, and all these kinds of factors, you're more likely to have an installer who understands what they can and can't do from the start, to be able to give that kind of good advice. And again, what I said about word of mouth, I mean, if you've got a neighbour or friend who's used an installer and they've done a great job and they've been there for after sales support and everything on that journey, then that's a really valuable way of finding a good, reliable installer by doing that. And again, with what all you guys are doing in terms of the community energy sector, working with companies who want to engage with those types of programs, then they've probably got a fairly good moral compass in terms of the fact they want to help, they want to offer some in-kind support, and do things in the right way. So sticking to those sort of trusted pathways, and again, for us, we always say to people about going to citizens' advice as a trusted pathway for advice, and looking at the council's website when it comes to finding out about schemes that are available and routes to go in to get grants and things. So there are different ways, ways around that, and what I would suggest.
Thank you.
Well,
And
another.
sorry, I was just going to say,
just another tip. Regardless of who's doing the work, if you're able to get an insurance-backed warranty, that's really good, much more valuable than just a sort of guarantee from the tradesman that's doing it. Because often these companies merge or go bust or whatever, and every 5 years or so, and then there's nobody left to to approach if something does go wrong. Whereas if you've got an independent insurance-backed warranty, you've always got at least some course of or recourse if you need it.
Yeah, and read the terms and conditions as well, I would say, because when it comes to cavity wall insulation, even if you've got a cavity insulation guarantee agency certificate, as soon as you've taken a window out, it's void. As soon as you've messed mechanically with that insulation, then it's not worth the paper it's printed on. So always check the fine print if you can be bothered to read it, because you really should as well.
Yeah, that's great. And also Sam Wilberforce from Dorset Climate Action Network helps to coordinate the Dorset Greener Homes initiative. And that's been really helpful because each of the case studies that have been put up, I think most of them they've recommended, installers or builders that they've worked with. So taking a look at that website is really helpful as well. So I'm very conscious of time. I just want to spend a couple of minutes telling us about the next webinar and a bit more about the event on the 1st of March. I was going to ask Jenny a question about natural materials, but if you're interested in natural materials, come along on the 1st of March because Jenny will be there. We also will have Stephanie Crombie, who is an architect who specializes in natural materials as well. So that should be a great event. But just to round off, before I say thank you to our speakers, I'll just share my screen again. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So our next webinar, this time next Thursday, 7 till 8, is called Building Skills for a Retrofit Future, Understanding the Technical Aspects of Retrofit. So we have John Butler, who's a sustainability consultant, who's going to be talking about the fabric side, issues around, air tightness versus ventilation, which is obviously can be quite confusing. And then we're going to spend some time on heat pumps, and in particular, questions like how does a heat pump work, which I still find confusing. And then we hope to have an example of a heat pump installation, which, as Peter says, actually, despite the propaganda, they usually do work if they're installed properly. Well, they always work well if they're installed properly. Then on the 1st of March, we have our in-person event, and everybody is very welcome to come along and hopefully get some questions answered. Then on the 6th of March, we have a webinar focused on the use of natural materials, and we have these two people, Steph Crombie and Tom Graham, who are part of the Architects Climate Action Network and are real experts on natural materials. And then the last one on the 13th of March will be with our partner Jonathan Atkinson from People Powered Retrofit, and that's looking at how we can work together, how we can create community focused approaches to retrofit. So, for example, getting groups of people with similar houses to work together on their houses. So that's the final webinar. And just to say a last thing about the event on the 1st of March, one of the things that Peter and I and Peter's colleague Steve Bright have been doing is beginning to put together a set of what are called housing archetypes in the Bridport area. So we're starting to do quite detailed assessments of different houses. And the idea here is that it's a good starting point when people are thinking about retrofit to think, okay, I live in this particular type of house. And Bridport is very interesting because we're a very old town. The earliest development was in the Roman times, and obviously you then had the Saxon periods. And so obviously the vernacular in Bridport has developed over that period. So we have many, many different houses, but the kind of houses we've started with are some of the a skilling house, a court orchard house, a 19th century terraced house, just to start saying, okay, what are the particular characteristics of these houses, and what are the best sort of approaches that we can take to retrofit those houses? And then we're going to go on and look at other, and there'll be a very interesting display that we're currently putting together to explain a bit more about this archetype approach. And then the last thing to say is that this is all geared or all contributing to thinking through what kind of retrofit service do we need for Dorset, which isn't just about the sort of the installations, but it's also about the assessment processes, the training that we need for contractors and others, the type of materials that we use, and how we can get community participation in these retrofit processes. Yeah, and then the last thing is we did a survey about retrofit and people's interests, and particularly about the concerns that people had. And we're going to be doing another survey, and you'll get an invitation to that survey, which is to, in particular, look at assessment services and whether people are interested in those assessment services. So I think I'll finish there because we're otherwise out of time. But I just want to finish by saying thank you very much to Jenny and to Peter for joining us, giving up their evening. It's very kind to do that. And thank you very much for agreeing to come on the 1st of March. Thank you everyone for joining us. And in particular, thank you, Laura, for actually making all this happen and organising it really brilliantly. And thank you again for joining us. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Very much.